let me, before I begin, just say one thing, which is that this event is co-sponsored by Kelema, which is the Translation Foundation, which I'm sure all of you who live in Abu Dhabi know about. It's a wonderful foundation whose charge is to translate into Arabic the world's heritage. And among the books that are being translated this year is Edward Said's The World of Text, the Critic. Other books of Said have already been translated into Arabic. This one hadn't been officially translated, hence the current translation by a very fine translator, a man called Mohammed Shaheen, which is currently underway and it should be out in February. And we're very pleased to co-sponsor this way of showcasing that book, a very difficult book. It gives us the occasion to do so, and we're very happy to do that. And I thank Kalama for their sponsorship. So, Marina, we spent 7 hours yesterday, I counted, on a bench in the Sheraton Khalidia. I left at 10 o'clock, so we have to rehearse that conversation in about 40 minutes. So I shouldn't spend any more time on prefatory remarks. How is it we came to this conversation? In my own mind, in early May, I read, as I had been doing in New York. I haven't actually done it so much since I've been in Abu Dhabi. But the TLS published a review of Dan Barisco's book, Said and Unsaid. It's a book full of rather excruciating puns about Said. So Said and Unsaid is obviously the pun dealing with Said, pointing out a lot of the mistakes and a lot of the things that he feels are unsaid in Said's book. It's certainly an anti-Orientalism book, and therefore it is it's a follow-up to Robert Owen's own For Lust of Knowing. That review of Dan Barisco's book was indeed written by Robert Owen himself, and it was the same edition of TLS that published the accounts of Daniel Deronda's.
Closer. You need to. Sorry, you're not clear.
Daniel Deronda's. There was a sort of commentary on Daniel Deronda's, on whether or not Daniel Deronda is, in fact, a sort of Zionist work. So the point is that the review led to a series of exchanges, rather acerbic exchanges, about Orientalism, and it showed that the views about Orientalism are still divided and very much antithetically divided. That it's still very much a sort of a vivid polemic, a sore wound, a wound that won't heal somehow. And in my own mind, it made me slightly impatient with the sort of continuation, but the unrelenting nature of the debate, which is always so predictable because the sides always seem to spar at each other from opposite ends of the ring, you know. And what I really felt was, why don't we talk about other aspects of Said's work, which Orientalism seems to have eclipsed, has eclipsed in most people's minds. He's remembered for Orientalism primarily, although, as Maria said, he wrote so much more and was a scholar of literature as much as a cultural polemicist, which led to the invitation for you to come. And indeed, it led me to write this blurb, which, having prepared for this conversation, I feel might have been written, the blurb, rather as a challenge more than a statement of facts. I'd like to read out the blurb and see as a challenge, to see whether it makes sense or not. The late Edward Said was one of the most formidable public intellectuals and cultural critics of the last 50 years. He is remembered chiefly for his highly influential Orientalism, his detailed critique of cultural and intellectual imperialism in the colonial period. Orientalism is perhaps the founding text of the post-colonial study of literature, culture, and politics. It also eclipses his other works in public consciousness and memory, and can lead one to forget the author's interest in literature tout court. The more purely literary aspect of his scholarship will be explored in this conversation, with its starting point in a reading of The World, the Text, and the Critic. So, I wonder if you see that as a challenge, and whether one can in fact say the purely literary aspect of his work.
I think the great difficulty with Edward Said is that his own personal circumstances constantly intrude upon our reading of it, even when we didn't have the good fortune to know him personally. He had such a charismatic presence. He was an extraordinary speaker. He was peripatetic all over the world and made himself visible and was extremely eloquent. He was also a very fine figure of a man with a very, very interesting story to tell. And as a result, all these sort of personal characteristics were very hard to put together with this firebrand, difficult hellraiser that had come up in the kind of controversies that attended his every move. And we can't any longer strip away. You can't read Said without all those things impinging. And that, interestingly enough, is the main point of the world, the text and the critic. That text exists enmeshed in the circumstances, both of their making and of their reception. And he himself is the greatest proof of the truth of this central tenet of the world, the text and the critic. But I was thinking about him because I did have the good fortune not only to know him, but actually to be much read by him and also fostered by him. He gave me lots of chances to speak in his seminars and so forth. So I feel very indebted to him and always did feel indebted to him. But I was also very frightened of him because, he had a sharp tongue, a very quick tongue, and also a very quick temper. So, though he was this urbane, incredibly widely read and very, very, literary and sophisticated and kind of gentlemanly man, he also could, he could suddenly catch fire. And so one had to always feel a little wary. But I was trying to think of an image that would capture him in a sense for you. And it isn't perfect, this image at all, but it comes out of the Arabian Nights. And in the city of brass, the travellers set out on a quest, and that's a very good setting for Said. He was an explorer, he was a very wide-ranging, restless mind. And so they set out on this great quest to find the great lost cities of civilization. And as they cross the desert, they come across a mysterious figure. This is a bronze horseman. Looks alive, but actually isn't alive. And this bronze horseman has the power that his spear will turn and revolve and point you in the direction in which you should go. And so they ask this horseman where they should go, and the bronze horseman leads them to the lost city. In the related medieval legends in Europe, and that's very much one of the points both of Said's work and of some of my interests, is that these are fusions and crossings and conversations. In the related legends about Virgil, the great poet of Rome, Virgil is a magician. And in Virgil's story, the bronze horseman points to the direction in which danger is coming. Now, I don't think that seeing Virgil and the Arabian Nights' bronze horseman is perfect at all, because Edward Said was so alive and so kinetic and so mobile and so incredibly responsive and also animated in every possible way. So the fact that this is not this is a statue, is not perfect. But I do think that he diagnosed troubles when they were coming, that he had an extraordinary ability, like a magnet, to go to a point of lesion, a point of tension, and to diagnose it for us and to make us think about it. He urged vigilance, and of course he urged resistance. And he was absolutely not in the business of consolation. And that's a very important and very uncomfortable position that he occupied. There was something of the fierce and angry prophet in him. And this added to his cult status in his lifetime. So to say purely literary, I think, is difficult, because we can't really receive him any longer as purely literary, even when he is being purely literary, and he is often that. I mean, there are essays in the world of the text of the critic on Joseph Conrad, on Swift, which are the essays of a very, very eloquent, analytical, literary professor. They're not particularly, adversarial or political or ideological at all.
Shall we take a cue from that and give a brief overview of the book?
Yes. I mean, do you want to?
You start.
Well, it begins with a kind of manifesto called Secular Criticism. And that continues into a big essay called The World, the Text and the Critic. And these two opening chapters situate Edward Said's argument that there cannot be such a thing as a text that does not take its place in the world, and that criticism, therefore, the task of the critic, is to look at that worldliness of the text, not only to see the text as a work of art for art's sake, or a pleasure in itself, but to always to situate it back in the world. The critic is an analyst, a diagnostician of the conditions of the making of that text, of that book. So that's very broadly speaking. They're very complicated and complex. And I mean, you mentioned the word difficult. You know, it's quite a read. This. I mean, it's not a bedside book, and I think it's not to be read in one go either.
No. But it's impossible.
Yes.
Is it too early to say at this point whether that process, that imbrication of the text in history and the author's imbrication in history through the text, whether it's a two-way process, whether we get that sense that the author fashions the text, and it's through the author that historical relevance comes into the text?
Well, obviously, yes. I mean, he chooses different authors, some of which have greater consciousness than others. But one of the surprises of the book, and I think one of the pleasures of the book, really, is that he chooses so many unexpected authors. I mean, for example, I know that you're very interested in his use of Wilde, Oscar Wilde, the wit, the dandy, the playwright who wrote the absolutely, almost perfectly functioning comedy, The Importance of Being Earnest, one of the most skillful and witty. You never think of Oscar Wilde as being an engagé intellectual writer of the kind that Edward Said seems to be tending to want to explore. But he likes Wilde. He
likes Wilde, but I think he's slightly misleading there, Said, because he makes, of course, Wilde was the sharp-witted dandy who sort of seems to float above society until he's sort of pulled down into the bowels of society and put in prison. But of course he very much suffers because of his circumstances and his time. He really is a product of his historical circumstances.
Yes.
But where on Wilde, on Oscar Wilde, the relationship of the text to history is articulated or is exemplified through a very particular text, which is the letter that Oscar Wilde wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas,
which got him into this charge of criminal sexual conduct, and led to his disgrace and, well, really to his utter decline in the end. But I think the point the Saidian point, which is a very good one, is that texts are not bounded by the jacket of a book or the cover of a book. That a text is a mobile, active object. He says a text really is an event. And that's a kind of term that it doesn't confine the book to the page. It doesn't confine writing to the representation of an imaginary invention. It actually it immobilizes a text, a piece of writing, like this letter that incriminated Wilde. It mobilizes it into the world. Mm-hmm. And his definition of the text throughout the book includes all kinds of other things that we might not think of as directly books. I mean, they're not books. He's interested in interviews, he's interested in recordings, he's interested in letters, he's interested in pamphlets, he's interested in posters. There's a kind of whole textual world, because those are so often the texts that do engage and reflect with the world. And actually that, of course, reflects his own. There's quite a lot of self-reflexive comments in this book. I mean, perhaps one's reading it because we know about him, because he's so famous and controversial. But I think that this idea of the text being also not a book is very much Said's own practice. Said was one of the books he published was a series of conversations with Daniel Barenboim. So these were just oral conversations. He was and absolutely, as I'm sure many of you know, extremely assiduous and writer for the newspapers, Al-Haram, and was very active on the radio and so forth. So he didn't. His idea of literature was absolutely by no means confined to the text published by a publisher. And he liked writers, and he liked to read in people who did that too.
Yes, he did an awful lot, and people are just parenthetically reminded me that in his obituaries, people like, I think Michael Wood and others have commented that he produced so much, but he always seemed to be either on the phone. It seemed to be impossible to calibrate or calculate the fact that he was actually producing the work that he was producing.
Yes.
The amount of it, because he had so much exposure, you saw it so much out and about.
Well, he saw literature as simply leaping beyond its confinement into what he called it as rather, it's a term he got from Michel Foucault, the sociological historian, philosopher, whom he rather admires, though he criticizes, he has certain limits. He places on his admiration, but he did admire Foucault, and he's probably closest to Foucault's cultural materialism than I think to any of the other philosophers whom he discusses. He's very generous in this book in the amount of time he gives to other people. I mean, that really has to be said. I mean, and if anyone in here in this room wants an account of Derrida's thought, Jacques Derrida, it's quite a difficult account, but it's a very lucid and a very remarkable account, I think. I mean, it gives him a very, very thorough reading, and then ultimately comes to the conclusion. This is in the essay called Between Culture and System, and it's a very close examination of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida's thinking. Inclined to favor them, to foster them. He wants people to read them, he wants people to think about them, but he ultimately rejects their conclusions in the name of cultural materialism, because Derrida is too theoretical, the text is too detached from the world, meaning is confined in the textuality of the sentence, and that's not enough for Said, who wants the sentence to work in the world, to make changes in the world. And Foucault is too pessimistic. Foucault says that this is a closed system of power, that writing will create these edifices and structures of power and knowledge, and you can't get out of them. There's no way out of them. Said wants us to resist. He wants us to get out of the systems.
We turn to a sense of the whole. The thing is, you mentioned Derrida, and we're interested in literary analysis, where we can find it, because there is so much that's non-literary analysis. Do you have a response to the way he uses, to the way Said exemplifies Derrida's reading of a literary text, which is that excerpt of From Great Expectations, where Pip goes to the theatre and sees Mr. Wopsle performing Hamlet. And it's a ridiculous performance of Hamlet.
It's a comic passage.
It's a comic passage, it's a comic performance of Hamlet. It's a hapless performance of Hamlet. And I just wondered what you make of that, if you did make anything of it.
Well, I think that he's illustrating there the idea that literature is a performance, and that it relies on the reader knowing the circumstances. He makes the point that Dickens, while parodying this staged presentation by amateurs of Hamlet, never tells us that it's Hamlet and never tells us it's Shakespeare, because there's a community of readers he knows that we know, and he relies on that. So he's making a broader point that the effects that Dickens so successfully achieves in this superb piece of comic writing depend actually on the text being in the world. And in a way, that's the premise for the importance of readings. I mean, in that passage appears in his essay in which he talks about how Derrida would read this, or how Foucault would read this. But actually, what the context is, I think, the larger context for us, is that he's making an equal claim for the role of the critic. And that's probably the single most contentious argument, I think, in the world, the text and the critic, is that he wants literary criticism to be at the level of novels or poems or filmmaking, because he sees this third player in the equation, the reader, the work of art, the work of literature, and the world. He sees the third absolutely necessary ingredient, this critic, this theoretical politician of knowledge, who is the conduit and the guide, the bronze horseman pointing for us. And he wants that, he loads that role with a lot of charisma, which of course he had, and also with a lot of responsibilities. And there are several essays in the book which actually criticize and take to task his colleagues and his contemporaries and so forth for not performing this role with sufficient dedication to the task in hand of actually stripping away the mystiques or stripping away the lies or just generally pushing us, making us see, refusing to be blinded or to be...
Yes. So we'll come back to the role of the critic. I just wanted to just go through some more of the basic brass tacks of the book in the sense of an overview. From what you said, it seems to me in that introductory essay, the first introductory essay in the first chapter really gives account of the whole book, and I would personally recommend anybody to read those first two essays, and they do have a sense of the whole book, of the program of the whole book. Auerbach is very important very early on.
This is Erich Auerbach, the author of Mimesis, who was a great German Jewish philologist who was exiled from Germany during, obviously, the rise of the Nazis and then found himself in exile in Istanbul. Some of you might know that, and wrote his great masterpiece, or his most successful book, most widespread and still very much studied and read, Mimesis, an account of representation of reality in Western literature. Sorry, you want to say about Auerbach? Because I just wanted to fill you in on who Erich Auerbach was.
Well, because we want to talk about the critic further on, but there seems to be a great contradiction in his fascination with Auerbach. Auerbach was one of the men that Said most admired.
Well, the last piece of writing that Edward Said published, the last piece of writing he wrote was the introduction to the centenary edition of Mimesis, 100 years since its first appearance in 2007. And it wouldn't have been 100 years, 50 years, 50 years. And that is astonishing for someone with Edward Said's reputation, an astonishing endorsement of humanist values. So he really wants there to, and that I think is the contradiction you're pointing to. He was absolutely not a critic in the world. Auerbach was reading texts as texts. I mean, he was reading stories and poems as stories and poems. He was not interested so much in that.
Well, he brought pretty much the spine of the Western canon to Istanbul in the sort of heart of the East, really. The heart of the perception of the East, really, from medieval and pre-modern Europe. So he brought the spine of the Western canon to Istanbul and completely ignored Istanbul. So it's a text that's completely unimbricated from the world. And it's in that gesture, I mean, it can be read as a gesture of ultimate Orientalist sort of disdain for the surrounds of the East.
Yes, it is. It is a contradiction. I mean, I think that that it's a very compelling image of this great mind, with so well furnished that he can write a book without his library. That was the point. Because he was in exile, he didn't have his books, so he wrote this great book without his references and did it out of his head. And this figure, I mean, the cover of Reflections on Exile, that Edward Said's own collection of essays on exile, shows Dante also brooding in exile. And Edward Said definitely had this as an image, a point of repair for him, a point of identification, the idea of the sage who is cut off from home, who builds the home of imagination and learning through his breadth of culture. And he called his autobiography Out of Place. And Erich Auerbach is definitely, when writing Mimesis, is a man out of place, who makes that place his place through his acts of reading, and in this case, writing. And that was very central to, because actually the task of the critic for Said required not belonging. I mean, he is always insisting in The World, the Text and the Critic, and in other writings, that one must not espouse a cause by becoming part of the official establishment of it. I mean, he wanted to be adversarial. He wanted to be cut off. And actual physical exile, homelessness, not being in the place where you belong, was an equivalent of that. Of course, what he's talking about, not belonging as a critic, doesn't have to be a not belonging as an expatriate or as someone who's homeless or someone who's been politically exiled. The two are not synonymous. But because of his own personal circumstances, he saw himself both as an exile, political exile, having lost the homeland of Palestine, having been moved to Egypt, then having been displaced again by his American education, and then his professorship at Columbia. So he was out of place, literally out of place. But he also felt himself to be necessarily, to choose to be psychologically out of place, not to belong, not to espouse, not to join, not to be a member of the club. That he felt was the absolute, to be on the other side of the barrier.
Yes. Do you think there are two other points to make about Auerbach and Mimesis, or these questions that I have? The way you describe, and everyone knows that this is true, that Auerbach didn't have it library, so he didn't write it as a scholar. In fact, Auerbach himself said that if you had to write this as a scholar normally does in the library, with footnotes and checking references, he would never be able to do it. In a sense, scholarship sort of impedes the writing, creative writing, to some extent. And it's, I don't know if this is too mischievous a question, but it's a lot of the criticisms of Orientalism are that it's a bit slapdash in its scholarship, that it's almost as if Said himself wrote this. He wrote what was in his head.
Yes. Well, he has been, I think, quite effectively criticized on these points of fact. And he certainly does sometimes dismiss, he will cut very cursorily in other works too, pass through a book or a writer, because he's in pursuit of a sort of larger quarry. And it would have been better if he'd revised. And I think actually that in general his books need re-editing, but that's a slightly different point. But I think that his breadth of reference, his extraordinary command and range of different fields that he had, his comparativism, the fact that he can glide very quickly from political theory to psychoanalysis to German philology, all on one page, and he never footnotes these references and never gives you a quick account of who these people might be. And I think that, if there's a chance, perhaps even for the Arabic translation of the World Text and the Critic, a glossary done by someone to actually give some background to who these people are, he's mentioning what their major works were when they lived, would be a real help to anyone reading the book. He's assuming a little bit of a classroom in which you can sort of perhaps explain these things later to the students after you've given the class. But as a book doesn't have the students in the room or the reader there for, hey, please tell me, it's not so. There is a slight forgetting of the reader's limitations, which are not his.
And the other question I had about Auerbach is of course, the title Mimesis representation of the world in the Western canon. Does that mimesis have anything to do with the program of the World of Text and Critic, in your view?
Well, I think he actually challenges the concept of mimesis. I think he's not very at all keen on Aristotelian mimesis, which is where Auerbach is getting the idea from, that art's task is to hold up some kind of mirror that might symbolize and condense what's happening. But because I think his task as a critic is to penetrate the mimesis into what it's hiding. That's where he became very controversial, and where some of his readings, have been much attacked. For example, the reading of, the famous reading of Mansfield Park, in which he picks up on the fact that, which happens in the book, that the West Indies possessions of the Bertram family are referred to in the course of conversation at Mansfield Park. And he says this reveals that Jane Austen knew perfectly well that a lot of 19th century great British fortunes depended on the slave trade in the West Indies and the trade in sugar. And it's just alluded to in passing. This is also true of the Brontes, in fact, which he also talks about. The Mad Woman in the Attic, the first wife, the first Mrs. Rochester in Jane Eyre, is also from the West Indies and an heiress and has brought money to Rochester. So he is making the point that Silver Fork novels, like Jane Austen's, are perfectly aware of the foundations of British wealth. this caused, I don't know if any of you know it, this caused the most unbelievable furore. You do not mess with Jane Austen in England. No, you do not. She is our Jane. And you do not start saying that she's got dirty feet because, she's profiting from... no, you don't do that. And but that's how his... he was praising her mimetic powers, actually. But he was, as a critic, tearing through, putting in what Derrida calls an entame. He was breaching the veil of representation in Jane Austen's novel to show us what's underneath, and that's what he thinks of as the critic's task. Actually, that's also an example of what he calls contrapuntal reading, which we should talk about.
So, just to go through the various bullet points that structure the canopy, let's say of whole, then we come to the subject of culture, and he spends a few pages talking about culture and really writing against Matthew Arnold.
Yes. Well, Matthew Arnold had a view that culture should pick out the best of what is known and made, and present that. It's a sort of improving, didactic view of culture. You civilize through culture. You civilize in terms of politeness. You create polite society, not civilized just in terms of making, giving people the chance to read or write or whatever. It's the idea that you make people good-mannered. And of course, Edward Said, though actually he was a man of impeccable courtesies and definitely someone who had an Arnoldian streak in him as a person, was very against this notion, the famous notion of sweetness and light, that culture produced sweetness and light. He was much too interested in the complexities and ambiguities, tensions and difficulties of civilization, of humans, of the history that we make ourselves, we make together, and to see that sweetness and light would contain all the things that he could see literature could do. It can do darkness and despair too.
Because of your, I'm wondering at this point, if I can ask you, because of the sort of work that you do in mythography, and which it does require you, and indeed you delight in seeing culture being produced in all walks of life, at the popular level, at the grassroots. You who are particularly keyed into where culture comes from throughout society, from top to bottom. Do you think that Arnoldian view of culture has any sway at all still? It's just so old-fashioned, 19th century. Well, it's a bit anachronistic for Said, in fact, to talk about.
No, I don't think so, actually. No, I think that there's a genuine debate that Matthew Arnold's concept gives rise to when we think of mass media. I think that in England there's a growing movement, for example, against public service broadcasting, the BBC. I don't know what people feel it like in this room, as you must see the BBC's overseas service sometimes, I suppose, or hear it. But anyway, this is now under attack because it's subsidized. And I think that the Matthew Arnold view did influence Lord Reith, the creator of the BBC, in his view of how culture should be delivered to the people. And I think that debate still exists, because what the anti-BBC people are saying is that culture should just be made by the private interests and be spontaneous expressions of that, whereas the BBC remit is to produce quality programs which might not get the same ratings. So there is, that may be too local a debate, but it's possibly that it's not a local debate, because it does affect the rest of the world. When we have all the satellite programs and so forth, we sometimes feel, that it would be nicer if they were edited, or somehow if we could actually think about a little bit more what the policy of all these satellite dish programs are. So I'm sure it does have relevance here, actually. And I think Edward himself was actually much more ambivalent than he gives the impression of being on the page, for this reason. And we talked about this before, but perhaps we're running ahead. But and that is that there's an odd nostalgia in a lot of his writing for an aristocratic, vanished world. And that may be for personal reasons, that he lived through vanishing worlds. But it may be that because, for example, he has 2 essays on Jonathan Swift, who was a conservative, a Tory, who represented the high Mandarin tranche of society in the 18th century in England. And he has a very, very powerful essay on the leopard by Lampedusa, which is a study in the decline of the Sicilian aristocracy, and he shows extreme sympathy with this novel.
That's in On Late Style.
Yes, and that is in On Late Style, yes, that's right. And anyway, there are other traces too. So there is a conflict within Said himself, which is a productive conflict, between a desire for modernity and for novelty and for challenging the status quo and a nostalgia for high culture. And he's not a low culture person. Actually, I know an anecdote, which is that his son actually started studying hip-hop when he went to Princeton. And I remember Edward Said saying that he couldn't believe that Wadia was going to Princeton and was being given courses in hip-hop. So, hip-hop music. So he was not someone who enjoyed the culture of the street very much.
Actually, when you spoke there, you spoke about Reith and the BBC, and just reminded me that he gave the Reith lectures on the role of intellect.
Yes.
Does that itself have?
Yes.
I haven't actually read those lectures. Do you know if those lectures actually dealt with this issue?
No, they didn't. They did deal with the issue that intellectuals were, inspired a lot of revolt and revulsion. And of course, later, when he'd given the broadcasts, he wrote the introduction to the book because he was absolutely heaped in scorn in England. We don't like intellectuals. Intellectuals are very suspect. We're not the French. And he wanted, and Edward Said wanted us to be much more like the French. I mean, he was a split personality himself because he spoke very beautiful French. And in fact, I've heard him lecture at the Sorbonne in French. He was absolutely fluent. And so he lived in two. And also he had many, many English characteristics. He'd been to this English public school in Cairo, Victoria College, and he very much dressed as an Englishman. He smoked a pipe, and he used English fountain pens, and he had quite a lot of sort of English, a rather old English style. I mean, from a slightly vanished world, but the one thing that he had, which was not English, was this great love and respect for intellectualism, and this great ambition that the intellectual should be a player in the difficulties of social engagement with the realities. And he called people to account for not taking up that banner. And that book, there it is on the screen now. I mean, it looks at Fanon, it looks at Baldwin, it looks at Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre, and he admires all these people for their ability to engage.
So should we move on?
Yes.
To briefly at least in giving account of the major ideas that he sees as being underpinning the affiliation, and affiliation is one of them.
Yeah.
The concept, at least which he underlines in the introductory essay, even though it's quite hard to see how it unfolds through the book. Do you think we should?
Yes. Well,
some account
yes.
of what you mean?
Yes. Well, it's quite opaque, in fact, I think. I mean, it's certainly what he points out that a lot of the myths that you mentioned, I was interested in, are about genealogies. They're about fathers handing on their traditions to sons. So that a lot of literature in the past will be stories of filiation, of something that is transmitted from generation to generation. And the metaphors for culture tend to be biological in this sense, that the culture itself represents biological stories of fathers and sons. I mean, you could say that Hamlet is a story of father and son story, in this case, a story of filiation frustrated, filiation in despair, but also that Shakespeare hands on to whoever comes after. We could say that Shakespeare is present in Coleridge, that there are these kinds of transmissions from generation to generation in kinds of using biological metaphors. He points out that with modernism, we get a kind of end of that, because most modernists consider there is a break with tradition. They see themselves as alienated, and their stories have no children in them. He makes this point. So both in the story and outside the story, yes, the wasteland is sterile. That you get these, that modernism, Virginia Woolf's books, it's not quite true of all Virginia Woolf's books. I mean, there are children in Virginia Woolf, in fact, quite a lot of children. But anyway, on the whole, he makes this assertion that that modernism, it begins to be obsessed with sterility. But the compensation for this end to the genealogical destiny of literature is affiliation, whereby people choose who they connect to. They choose their kinship. And this is a very, very important idea for Said. There is no biological transmission. There's no kind of natural handing down. We abolish nature. We only have culture. Culture is selected and opted for. We choose who we attach ourselves to, who we affiliate to. They are our kin. And that connects to an idea that he puts as an epigraph to his introduction to Mimesis, which is a quotation from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in which he says that we are born in one place, but we make ourselves from then on. So he was completely interested in abolishing the givens of nature and acquiring a whole set of other sets of allegiances and affinities, what Goethe called, the German poet Goethe called elective affinities, chosen associations, chosen affiliations. And yes.
So in Eliot you go from the sterility of Prufrock and the Waste to the affiliative associations of Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets.
Yes, and he's saying in that case that T.S. Eliot chose the Anglican Church as his other family. That the first poems, Prufrock and the great poems, The Wasteland, are barren. They are about wildernesses in which there is no genealogical descent. But when he emerges into affiliation, where he feels himself at home, it's a created home, a selected home, a made home, one he's chosen, which is the Anglican Church. I mean, you make of that what you wish, but that's, I mean, he's advocating that.
Well, the trouble I had with it is because it's not clear, or you take it between these ideas as inhering inside the text and outside the text, or at least between the authors of the text and the community that authors the text.
Yes, in fact, there's a lot of that kind of slippage in his criticism because he sees the text as being in the world. He very often doesn't they're confused. So actually you don't know whether you're reading what's in the book or reading what's outside the book that was part of the worldliness of the book.
Right. And there's last part to it, which I find even more opaque than this. Well, that's not opaque, it's just difficult, but this is slightly opaque, which is that he saw this affiliation as being a tripartite process. We'll describe two parts, right? The move from affiliation to affiliation. He says that there's a third part whereby the affiliative groupings that are formed around texts, around people and their culture, become affiliative again, become generic.
Yes.
And that's not. So the idea is that affiliation is a sort of vertical. It has a vertical movement, from father to son, from mother to daughter.
Yes.
That affiliations are more synchronous. They're more horizontal.
Well, I think there he means that books. I mean, he does believe in that books and writing create more books and writing. I mean, they do have a vitality in them that makes them leap out from their borders, which is why they're so powerful and why he wants people to be responsible the way they both read them and write them. And he's right about that. But I mean, I think you could to go back to the Arabian Nights, you could see that as an example of what he's talking about, which is that the translators who choose to create their version in whatever language it is of this great book, of the 1001 Nights, then create a body in that new culture let's take the French example. The 1704, which Edward Said has written about, Antoine Galland translates the 1001 Nights, the Mille et une Nuits, into French. This is the first European language translation. Immediately, you get a whole pool of writers which include Voltaire, the great satirist, using elements of the Arabian Nights to practice their own craft of writing and to take their texts into the world. So they are affiliating themselves with the Arabian Nights, which has appeared in French, but they also are descendants. So they are, in Said's terms, they've become the children of the Arabian Nights. And actually Robert Irwin, in his book, has a whole chapter called The Children of the Nights, which is all about different books, from Borges to Angela Carter to various writers across the globe, actually, who have borrowed storytelling devices and plots from the Arabian Nights. So they are, and he calls that the Children of the Nights. They are the Children of the Nights, these books.
So that's the third part.
Yes.
As you see it, yeah. So just we're more or less fill out that canopy. Perhaps we should just talk about Vico and Swift, or Swift as an example of what he says about Vico, because he makes a lot of Vico in this book, which was puzzling to me just because I don't know Vico, and I don't know if Vico is Vico a well-known person.
I'm not going to ask you to. I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands. I think that Vico is a very, very difficult writer, and I think that this is Giambattista Vico. He was an 18th century Neapolitan jurist and a professor of eloquence at the University of Naples. And actually, there's a huge plaque to him in Naples, which is one of those kinds of Italian plaques that I love, marvelously engraved in letters, and it says, most illustrious, most illuminating, most everything, it goes on in an Italian way. Giambattista Vico, the child of our town, of our city, Naples. So he's a hero in Italy, but I think outside Italy he's very little known. And one of the characteristics of Edward Said's thought is that Giambattista Vico published The New Science in 1745. One of the characteristics of sometimes of Said's thought, which I think I alluded to a little bit before, is that he does assume that we know more than we know. And he doesn't, for instance, give us a chapter on Vico, which would be a help, I think. He gives us quite a lot about Vico, but it's quite compressed, and it's quite difficult. But he likes Vico because, and this is the important point, and I think the only point really to hold on to, actually, because I think the rest is too detailed in a way, but the really main point to hold on to with Vico is that Vico believed that history was always in the making. It is always moving. And it is people, it is humans who make history. Now, in 1745, it was still you could have possibly argued, he was in a Catholic country, you could have argued that God made history. God did not make history for Vico. Humans made history, and they were responsible for the history they made. And that's why Said is attracted to him.
Also anti-Cartesian.
Yes.
As well as being anti-religious.
Yes. So he believed in, there were various things that he believed. I find this quite puzzling that Said likes him so much, because one of the things that Vico argues is that history, while it is always being made, it doesn't progress necessarily, it goes through cycles, and these cycles then repeat. So there is there's a kind of almost biological, like a plant or something, the seed grows, it flowers, and then it withers and dies, and then it drops its seeds again and grows again. And so he has a sort of this cyclical vision of history. And I find that a little more determinist than Said usually is. Said doesn't, he's not a Marxist, Said, in the sense that he doesn't believe that things are just moving towards a final, some sort of resolution. But he doesn't really believe in this kind of necessary entropy either. He believes that there is always going to be change, not necessarily for the better, but it's not cyclically determined. And I think, so anyway, Vico, like Auerbach, is one of the people who holds his mind in enchantment. He is enchanted by Vico and he's enchanted by Auerbach, and they're both of them rather anomalous for Edward Said's general argument. But I think that's natural, and that's actually very attractive about Said, that he does, he does love the writers he loves. He's a very warm-blooded critic. And was definitely there's a shadow, not a shadow, an illumination from the Nights, which had appeared, just shortly before in English translation. And Jonathan Swift is not the only one. But actually, Edward Said doesn't talk about that side of Swift. He's interested in the political Swift. And Swift is an exile. Swift was exiled to Ireland. And so he identifies again, he's one of the people. And he likes him because he's outside the system. Swift had trouble. They had a bit of mental trouble. He was not altogether stable in his mind. So that made him marginal as well. And Said is attracted to him for his marginality. But I think we should talk a little bit about the contrapuntal, because and though he doesn't mention this in terms of Swift, talking about marginality brings it up again. This is an important theory in Said's for Said's reading.
So should we just list them just briefly before we contrapuntal readings? Repetition, originality. They seem to be the three notions. In terms of giving a sense of the whole book, those seem to be the outstanding ideas. Outstanding in the sense the ones we haven't talked about yet.
Yes.
To talk about briefly.
Yes.
Because they're difficult. So contrapuntal is one. Repetition, originality. And when you talked about Weissmuller, Johnny Weissmuller,
yes.
I mean, you thought about contrapuntal. Not because it's an obvious thing to do, it's because we talked about this yesterday.
Yes.
And when you were explaining contrapuntal readings, you gave Johnny Weissmuller as an example of this. Why is Johnny Weissmuller, in his reflections...
You have to say who Johnny Weissmuller is. This is not a generation who knows. Or perhaps they do, but...
No, everybody knows who Johnny
No, I don't know. Absolutely.
We have to put a wave hands. No, Johnny Weissmuller was the great Tarzan. It's like the Sean Connery of 007's, of Tarzan.
He was younger and more beautiful
than Sean Connery. He was the great Tarzan.
Yes. And Edward Said saw the Tarzan films in Cairo. And he talks about, in Out of Place, how much he enjoyed going to the movies and seeing Tarzan. And then in one of his essays, not in the World Text and the Critic, but in another of the collections. Which one is it? I get mixed up with his books. On Late Style, is it? Yes. In On Late Style, he discusses Johnny Weissmuller. Which one is it in?
Reflections of Exile.
It's in Reflections on Exile. Okay, sorry. And the point about the contrapuntal is that he can enjoy Tarzan. He has what he calls a double consciousness, because while he sees that Tarzan is, from the position of a post-colonialist, a disgraceful portrayal of the primitive and etc., and full of racist overtones and undertones, and a reprehensible piece of work that peddles American values in the most flagrant fashion. At the same time, he finds himself responding to it very warmly, and he believes that this being in and out of a condition, both occupying two spaces at once, is a kind of contrapuntal reading of texts. And he uses this method quite often. He says that he really enjoys it, and he says, and he relates it to his condition of being out of place, to being an exile. He says that the exile can occupy two different mentalities at once, and that this can actually enrich and give a layer, as in musical counterpoint. You have two. You were saying that musical counterpoint is much, much stricter than this rather vague metaphorical application of this metaphor. But basically he means that it's like being two hands, having two hands. Two different things are happening at once when you read.
Yes. What about repetition, do we? Well, these all relate, actually. Contrapuntal is the word contrapuntal is a technical term in music. Of course, music, his writings are shot through with references to music, to all sorts of music. Partly because he was a pianissimo kid. And in his discussion of repetition, he makes quite a lot of, or he discusses at some length the work of Johann Sebastian Bach. Do you want to say something about what he means by repetition before we...
Well, it's another of his quite slippery essays, and they take a bit of reading, these essays, and but anyway, I think with the essay on repetition, it's in definitely two halves. The first half discusses repetition of history as farce, the famous adage. And he looks at Karl Marx's rhetorical masterpiece, the 18th Brumaire, and he applies that model, that the second Napoleon, who comes after the first Napoleon, is a repetition, and he is a total degradation. The original model, when repeated, becomes farcical and absurd and corrupt and appalling. One might think some things about Napoleon the First too, but anyway, the second Napoleon exemplifies repetition as decline, as a falling away from standards. But he then withdraws from that position altogether, and he makes a case for repetition, which is, in a sense, what you're saying about Bach. And he's right. I think it's a much more congenial argument. He begins to say, no, repetition actually reinforces. Repetition can refigure. Repetition can bring pleasure. Repetition can become critique. Of course, a very important role for him. If you start, actually looking at something closely and repeating it, you will actually disclose more meanings in it. Mm-hmm. So he then comes out in favor of repetition. And actually, he mentions in passing somewhere Borges' famous short story, Pierre Menard and the Quixote. And this is actually very strong, I think, a real key to Edward Said's readings of literature. This is the famous story in which the Argentinian writer Borges describes how somebody sets out to write Don Quixote. Well, actually, they realize that they can't write Don Quixote, so they decide they will write a chapter of Don Quixote. And so they, by dint of unbelievable effort and incredible concentration application, by years of work, the writer, Pierre Menard, produces a word-for-word exact version of chapter 3 of Don Quixote. And the point of the story is that though every word is identical, the text is different, because having been exactly repeated by a totally different process of production, in a totally different context, for a totally different new readership, it is actually a different text. And though Said, doesn't really discuss this in any great detail, it is a sort of modernist example, a perfect modernist example of what he's talking about in terms of the fortunes of a piece of literature. That it is not, ever can be, a contained object that retains its essence and identity in whatever circumstances it finds itself.
Yes. So we should move on, I think. We haven't. We spent 7 hours yesterday. Our interest, but we'll get there. We should. I think in order to invite the audience to join in our conversation, we should.
Yes, definitely.
Leapfrog over some of the things we have in mind.
Yes, where are we? Oh, yes, we should.
We'll talk a bit about lifestyle later, but get to Orientalism. I ask you as a sort of opening gambit into this subject. About where we would be. Where would we be if he hadn't written Orientalism?
Yes, I know you wanted. I thought about that because you wanted to ask about that, and first of all, I think that he really. You said, would the world be different if Said had not, written? And I think that, or perhaps, anyway, I think that Orientalism, for all its proven flaws, was an absolutely necessary book. And I think it also can be read exactly in the way that he asks us to read other people. A book in its world, in its context, which keeps changing. And it was written in 1978. And in 1978, this was an urgent, absolutely urgent and undisclosed and unexplored matter. And in the foreword to the reprint, he says how he couldn't even find a publisher to begin with. I mean, the subject was considered to be so arcane and the argument so kind of, off the wall that he didn't. And then suddenly it was translated into, 40 languages because he really had identified an unexplored area of the map, of the mental map, and it was waiting to be uncovered, and it needed to be uncovered. And the controversy that it then released into the world was a necessary controversy, but of course it also has changed the nature of the book. It changed the nature of Edward Said's own reputation and character. It changed his life. I mean, and all that, I think, makes it, really, truly an event, a book as event, and not an event to be regretted one bit, because what he then did was, for all the stuffy English departments, he opened up the possibility that you could have a literature that was, what he calls a Weltliteratur, this Goethean idea that there was a world literature, not confined by national boundaries, but existing in its historical relation across time, so that you could have this. It became, there were lots of jargon words used for it, sort of post-colonial literature. He didn't like the jargon words, but in England, in English literature, it made a huge difference. We had, the whole of now contemporary fiction has been absolutely exploded into a flowering. I'm sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors, but we've had so many different forms of English being written in the forms of novels that have been recognized and publishers are avid for them because the field is there. When I first started writing, I went to a bookshop to see what contemporary novels were sort of out on the front desk to be, and I would pick some up and read them to see what was sort of happening in the world then. Well, it was Kingsley Amis and Susan Hill. I don't know if that means anything to you. I sort of hope it doesn't. But anyway, but these were so parochial. I mean, this was the absolute narrowest possible self-gazing that could be undertaken. And then very soon after, not entirely, caused by Orientalism, but nevertheless, curiosity started being stoked. And that made a huge difference. And we got this range of writers from, Sri Lanka, all of them, of course, writing in English, not all of them always writing in English, but many of them writing in English, from the Indian subcontinent, from now, of course, from China, too. So this idea that you don't need to be representing mimetically the metropole, that you can represent, that you should, and that we should read about other. He contributed that.
Right. So you mentioned Weltliteratur, of course, Goethe's phrase, and which leads me to ask a question about your own exemplification of how one can use Said, not use him, but just be in that sort of episteme of post-Said. I remember actually when he gave a lecture at Oxford, once he gave the Antonius lecture, and his introducer said that Orientalism gave a new meaning to P.S. We are now living in post-Said. You can't whether you like it or not. In terms of your own nuancing, I suppose, of his arguments, your essay on the compass of story has an interesting, a fascinating discussion of Goethe. In a way, it's a corrective on Said's own view.
Well, I was always very distressed that he was, so under attack because there was so much else to him, and I always felt it was being eclipsed a bit. And then he created this orchestra, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and I wanted to know why the orchestra was called that, and it was he just told me that it was Goethe's poems, the West Eastern Divan, and that he loved these poems. Anyway, then he died very soon after I had this conversation with him. So I then went into the reason for the name of the orchestra. And it seemed to me that this showed that his attack on Orientalists was very much more nuanced than people have given him credit for. This is you'd think, if you just had a kind of, the sort of newspaper knowledge of what the argument of Orientalism was, that he could not possibly like Goethe's poems called the West Eastern Divan. Here is Goethe pretending to be, an Oriental, wine, women and roses, song, and addressing Hafiz, the Persian poet, across the centuries, entirely enraptured with the kind of luxury, sensuality, dream, perfection of pleasure world, dying old poet in Germany, finding a new youth, a new ability to love through being stimulated by thinking about the Orient. It seems to be absolutely flagrant examples of the Orientalism that we think of as as Edward Said's Critique. Well, it can't be, because that was the first title he thought of for the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. It was never gone back on. It was always the title he had for it. And so he saw it, actually, as a meeting of minds. He liked the idea that Goethe's imagination was completely fired by this encounter. He liked the fusion across time and culture. He liked the fact that this was a mobile text, that Hafiz's Persian poems, his lyrics, had kind of moved across time and space and just entered Goethe's head and created this new work.
But you read...
it's affiliation, in fact.
Yes.
It's an affiliation which becomes affiliation.
But you read Goethe's fascination with Hafiz and the other Persian and Arab poets as being a facet of his late style. According to the way Said described late style, which was not so much about late style, but a late condition of life, a sort of attitude to life, even though he himself didn't talk about Goethe.
No, that's right.
He didn't exemplify Goethe.
Yes. Well, he argues that late... he rather movingly, because he's himself dying of leukemia while he writes on late style, he describes how lateness is not a condition of harmony and quietness and resolution and drawing back and slowing down, that it's actually very often in Beethoven he gives an example. Who are the others he gives? He has many examples. Strauss, Richard Strauss,
Visconti.
Luchino Visconti, the filmmaker, Glenn Gould, the pianist. These people at different ages, but in their late period, some of them don't know they're going to die, so they don't know that they're in their late period. But towards the end of their lives, they actually wrestle with greater difficulty. They wish to be anomalous. They wish to be anachronistic. They wish to take leaps where they haven't done before. That they don't want resolution. They actually want things to be rather unfinished and hard and rebarbative. And of course, a lot of this is autobiographical. It's very much a description of his own sort of going out with the rage. But at the same time, he sees the West Eastern Divan. I see it as an ecstatic outpouring in this late period of Goethe's life that does actually reflect Said's own arguments about lateness. But of course, the other thing that I say, which is not, which is a counter to Orientalism, to the argument of Orientalism, and which is something I'm very, passionately keen about. And he does have glimmerings of this argument in his essay on Schwab. There's an essay in the World, the Text and the Critic, about Raymond Schwab, who was a great French Orientalist. And this is a very favourable essay, very different in spirit to Orientalism, a very favourable essay about this French Orientalist. And in that he says that Raymond Schwab was interested in the Orient as cause, i.e. he was interested in the active effect of the idea of the Orient on Western culture. And he saw that when Raymond Schwab's book is called La Renaissance Orientale, the Oriental Renaissance, and he argues that this is a book that was published in 1950 in France. In this book, he argues that Europe underwent one Renaissance in the 15th century, as we all know. Then it underwent another Renaissance, which has not been discussed, and that was when it encountered the Orient. The Orient so-called. So in the 17th and 18th century, after its encounter with the Orient, Europe underwent another Renaissance. And that's the burden of his book. And in that, he says, this is the Orient as cause. The Orient, released something that then created many, many different cultural effects of all kinds, including learning, including scholarship, and so forth. So that was Schwab's argument. And this Orient as cause is something that I'm very interested in culturally. And I identified that in Goethe's great last book, the West Eastern Divan. And then, of course, in its own offspring, which is the orchestra, which you all know about, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra.
You said earlier that Said sort of deliberately chose to be out of place, and this is something that I picked up myself from reading Orientalism. I picked up a sort of very stubborn and often I felt quite ungenerous kind of attitude. What effect do you think this has had politically in the Arab world?
Oh, I'm not the person to ask that, I'm afraid, because I really, I should have said earlier that I'm very, very delighted to be here, and because I'm extremely inquisitive and long to learn and know, but I'm very underinformed. I mean, I think there are probably people very much better equipped to answer that in the room, actually. I can tell you what effect it had in England, or in Europe, which of course is very negative. I mean, there was a huge, well, as Philip was describing, I mean, there could be nothing more controversial than, as you said, people picked up on this ungenerosity. They disliked that, the recalcitrance, the truculence of his tone, and he was like that. That was he was could be very fiery and cross. Yeah, it was his mode. So yes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ungenerosity, ungenerous to whom? Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, he one of the things that he probably would have made his life a little easier for himself is that he was very thin-skinned about criticism. So whereas there are quite a lot of writers and scholars who actually are quite pleased to have a mistake pointed out, and will say, oh, thank God, I never would have noticed it. Next edition, I'll change it. Thank you so much. Sorry?
I agree.
Edward was not like that. Edward was very, very cross if something was pointed out to him. And that made life difficult for him. He would have made many more friends of the people who had initially criticized him if he'd had a... And who knows, if you read Out of Place, many of the reviews say that there is elements of self-pity in it, but actually, if you read it, it is an account of an unhappy childhood, and his father really treated him badly. I mean, if you accept his account of it, and they're fairly anecdotal stories, which sound extremely convincing, and I think he was a kind of rather he wasn't sort of physically battered, but he was emotionally battered as a small child, and he remained that sort of defensiveness and slight vanity that you can't accept criticism comes from being both a high flyer and an unloved child. I mean, the two things very much merge, and then you have this prickly and uncomfortable response.
But in the world of text, the critic, there are two discussions. A discussion of Ernest Renan and the discussion of Louis Massignon, and he's very damning about Ernest Renan, and on the whole he likes Louis Massignon, although in the end he doesn't like him as an Orientalist. But really his attitude to them, in reality, should be probably reversed, because he saw Renan as being part of the establishment. Whereas in fact, if he knew more about Renan, he would have seen that he wasn't establishment. He wasn't an establishment figure. He gave a lecture at the Collège de France, but he was soon kicked out of the Collège de France for questioning the divinity of Christ. Whereas Louis Massignon, who he saw as a sort of mystical figure, therefore a sort of quasi-Muslim figure, a man who had adopted Islam due to his spiritual temperament, was in fact a very, very, very aligned with the establishment, and that's sort of totally missed on Said. And so, it's just one example in that book of things that he got wrong. I don't suppose you would ever have thought to invert his account.
Actually, you asked about Swift, and of course one of the things he has in common with Jonathan Swift is this scathing tongue. So he probably identified with Swift because of that. And I mean, I took the person who asked about generosity or lack of generosity, I took that as being him in the world. But of course, you answered quite rightly of him in the texts. And actually, in texts, he's got this, scathing tongue, and it's a form of rhetoric. I mean, it's a form of it's a performance of writing, and he was rather good at it. And it has a certain, scorching power on the page.
First of all, I would like to begin with a word of thanks to Marina Warner for a book that had a huge influence on me about 20 years ago or more, The Myth and Cult of the Virgin Maries. And I was trying to come to terms with at least one aspect of an Irish childhood. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And the second thanks is to New York University for having me here and for this opportunity to learn more about a literary hero as well as a literary heroine. So thank you very, very much. My question for you both is just thinking about text and the worldliness and historicity of text. What are your, or has Edward Said at any stage written or commented on the 3 sacred texts from the Middle East and their worldliness or otherwise? Has he dealt with that in any of his writing?
Well, he has a section of this book actually on the Quran, where he produces a rather opaque and quite esoteric theory, which he, I don't know where
from the Middle Ages.
Culled it from 11th century.
Yes,
where there was a Zahirite.
Two different ways of reading. Very, very interesting, actually. It's about 4 pages.